Hey guys, what is going on? So today I wanted to talk about tracking progress as a natural lifter and some of the traps that I and many other natural lifters have fallen into that have caused us to waste a good amount of our time when we really didn't need to be, and some ways that we can kind of shy away from those methods of tracking progress and focus on some, in my opinion, much better methods to actually objectively look at, hey, are we making progress or are we just kind of spinning our wheels or pretending like we're making progress by focusing on a few select things? And what can we do about that? How can we structure our training and our nutrition and everything else to really focus on the things that are going to matter the most in terms of really making progress? So I'll talk about some of the mistakes that I've made. And these are, not only mistakes that beginner lifters make, but I really think natural lifters, when progress is really slow, this is the most problematic thing to go for, because even if you're a beginner and you're focusing on the wrong things, you are going to make progress. But when you're advanced and you're focusing on the wrong things, this can lead to a lot of waste time. And it takes a lot of time to make progress as an advanced lifter. And so at that point, you really don't want to be wasting it. So the first thing, and I've seen this many times, both in terms of, myself going after these goals, but also just generally advanced lifters go to more extreme lengths to make progress when, things are kind of slowing down, is focusing on scale weight way too much. And so obviously people know that if you're going up in the scale, if you're gaining weight every week, that can lead to gains. And simply the act of gaining weight can mean that you're building more muscle or, putting on more strength. That can certainly be the case. But if we notice that, hey, I'm getting this positive reinforcement of, as I see the scale weight go up, my lifts are also going up, and I just keep fighting that, and I really focus on getting that scale weight up as much as possible, it's a very slippery slope that, one, can lead to a lot of fat gain, but two, can lead to periods of time where we're focusing on just increasing numbers without the substance behind it. So yes, increasing muscle mass increases the weight on the scale. Yes, gaining a little bit of body fat is going to be beneficial to making that muscle gain be a little bit faster. Yes, for a lot of individuals, just simply gaining weight is going to allow us to progressively overload, and progressive overload is a very good way of tracking our progress. But when we constantly have that positive reinforcement of number up, that means good, and we don't understand the nuance of the situation, that's when we can fall into the trap. And so for me, going through periods where the heaviest that I ever got, I was 278 pounds. And looking at myself now, even though I may have a little bit less mass in some of those heavy hitting areas like the legs and the back, currently sitting, 30 plus pounds below that, I'm like, wow, well, I had about 30 pounds extra fat that I really didn't need to have in my body. And if I was one of those people who could potentially gain strength just by adding fat mass, that would be a very misleading path to go down. Plus, how much time is it going to take for us to cut that weight back and really notice, like, oh, wow, I went on this 1 year, 2 year bulk thinking I made all this progress. But once I peeled all the fat away, not only did I waste so much time, peeling that fat away, but I noticed that, wow, my gains really weren't as good as I thought they were. So this is something that it is a necessary thing, in my opinion, to bulk, but we tend to take it to extremes. And I am a prime example of that, somebody who's done that in the past. And, when you're advanced and you're looking for any little, piece of progress that you can make, that's a very easy thing to cling to, especially when in the past it's been beneficial for you. But just getting too caught up in those numbers can be very detrimental. Two, this kind of goes hand in hand with the gaining weight thing, but the progressive overload aspect. So if we structure our training where we're either sacrificing form, we're limiting volume, we are prioritizing certain lifts that we want to put at the beginning of our workout simply for the, mental stimulation that we get of hitting a PR. Well, are you really making progress if you are focusing mainly on neurological adaptation, getting, larger breaks in between sets? We're focused on, hey, I want to bump this bench press to the beginning of the workout because then I can lift the most weight and that's going to feed my ego the most. And then if we start to kind of mail it in other parts of our program, or something that I do a lot is, I may skip leg day. And so if my overall recovery is improved by not training legs, and that's feeding into my potential to continue to hit PRs on an upper body lift, well, you're kind of stepping over dollar bills to pick up quarters, and you're really focusing on the wrong thing, right? Progressive overload is not really something that we decide to do, and because we enforce our desire to do progressive overload, that in and of itself doesn't cause us to grow muscle. It's that our body actually makes an adaptation from the training that we're doing, and that means that we're able to progressively overload, right? It's less about willing your way to get that extra rep, or, in the worst case scenario, sacrificing your form to get that extra rep, when it's much more about, hey, my body's actually physically capable of pushing more weight. And this is a combination of a neurological thing, and this is a combination of actual contractile tissue that we're building. So yes, the neurological aspect is a big component, and that's something that's going to happen no matter what. But what we're really after is the muscle gain at the end of the day. And unless you're focusing on a big lift, like you're a power lifter and you're focusing on the bench press, just simply getting the weight up is not the objective, right? The objective is to progressively overload as an outcome of building the muscle mass. And that's generally what I think people are going for when they're trying to both gain size and strength, is they're not necessarily powerlifters trying to, get their ego and have the highest lift possible. They just want a combination of being strong and looking strong, right? And that's a pretty reasonable goal to have. On the flip side, if we are not focusing on progressive overload at all, I still think that just focusing on getting a pump, focusing on getting a good contraction, focusing on challenging ourselves, and really not even tracking the weight, I would say that extreme end of it, while still, again, pushing yourself, that extreme end of it is much more conducive to actually building contractile tissue, and that's going to improve your strength potentially down the line. Whereas the person who's entirely focused on progressive overload, that's the only thing that they care about, that's going to lead to a lot more, time wasted, in my opinion. So I would say try to have a balance, obviously. Don't just completely stop tracking your weights and not care about progressive overload. Don't care about, not getting stronger. But in terms of actually challenging the muscle, I think that's going to be the main thing that's going to give you the gains that you're looking for, right? So sometimes you got to go by feel from a bodybuilding perspective, and when it comes to just putting on pure strength, a lot of that can be attributed to, neurological adaptation, and then also just improving your form overall and getting used to that. And if you're not improving your form in terms of getting a better contraction, you're improving your form in potentially ways you can cheat the rep. And while I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for all movements, that's absolutely something that people do, and it can be beneficial in some circumstances, right? So progressive overload, I think, is kind of a big trap in terms of, hey, this is like the end all be all of gaining size, and I really don't think that's the case. And so to kind of feed into that to a greater extent, I'm somebody who really, when I put on weight, and I understand I am kind of an anomaly in this, when I put on weight, I don't just instantly get stronger. Some people, their leverages improve, or they're just simply, eating more calories. Potentially they're going from eating like 2,000 something calories to 3,000, and that's enough for them to feel really good. Well, maybe it's just because I have a higher, calorie threshold where even when I'm cutting, I still eat pretty high calories. But when I start gaining weight, I don't immediately gain size, or I don't immediately gain strength. And so I don't have that positive feedback of just instantly focus on progressive overload. And that's a blessing and a curse, because when I do start cutting and I notice that my lifts aren't going down, but they're actually going up, I'm like, wow, I must be gaining muscle mass. And then I feed into that by, when I'm cutting, I really focus on a few lifts here. And really, I think this is something that we see a lot of times in the low volume group of people, where they're like, wow, I'm progressively overloading, I must be getting way bigger. When the reality is they're taking away all that extra volume that would have been, stimulative in terms of hypertrophy. And they're just focusing on the outcome. They're just focusing on the number that, they're moving. And even if their form is good, it's like, hey, if you went from doing 10 exercises to doing 2, you're probably going to get really freaking good at those 2 exercises. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're building more muscle. And in fact, a lot of times it means you're building less, because you're not getting as much volume in. You're not hitting the muscle from a variety of different angles. And just overall, I think there's a certain amount of work that you should be doing, both in terms of volume and frequency, that a lot of these low volume guys don't get. And I fell into this trap. I talked about that in one of my previous videos recently, of me really feeling like that progressive overload that I was getting either when I was cutting or bulking. I was like, man, I'm absolutely, getting way bigger because my lifts are just skyrocketing. And then cut down, realize, oh, maybe wasn't that big of a deal. Or, oh, I went back to this other exercise and I'm not that strong. Maybe I'm actually not gaining as much muscle as I thought I was. So obviously there's a lot of nuance in that situation, but something to keep in mind. I think progressive overload, in the way that we think we have agency over it, is kind of flipped. It's more of an outcome of correct training as opposed to the thing that predicts good training. And so the things that I think are a better representation of if we're actually gaining progress are measurements. I think measurements are not perfect, but measurements, and especially doing it at similar body fat percentages, is a much better way of gauging, like, hey, how big are my arms? Last time I was this weight, my arm measured this. Last time I was this weight, my waist, my thigh, everything. You can track how big are those measurements getting relative to your waist size. And waist size is something that, maybe it fluctuates a little bit depending on how bloated you are. But if you get a lot of data and you're writing this down consistently, I think measurements are a far better way of assessing if you're actually making progress. And even if we're, gaining muscle mass, let's say over a year, we're the same body weight as we were last year, but our waist is a little bit smaller, our arms are a little bit bigger, and you can be like, wow, well, my arms actually measure just about the same, maybe slightly higher as they did last year at this body weight. But considering my overall fat mass is down at the same body weight, I definitely did make progress. So that's a really good way to look at it. Another one, this is less of a science and more of a kind of guessing game, but body fat percentages. And so if you can really be objective with yourself, this is a way that you can really gauge progress and say, I was a similar body fat percentage here and here. But sometimes, given the weight differences that we see on a day-to-day basis, 1% body fat may be like a 2-pound difference. And if we say I'm 15% here and 15% here, and I'm 2 pounds heavier here, you may have actually not noticed that 2 pounds of fat being added, or maybe there's an extra pound of water or something like that. So something that a device that I used to have that no longer works, which is a shame, it was a body scanner that also took my measurements. And so if I did that consistently, I would have a lot of data to show, hey, what is my body fat percentage reading, which in and of itself is not all that accurate, but then what are my measurements? And so the actual device took my measurements, and then if I took my own measurements, all three of those data points combined told a very good story on if I was making progress or not. But then when I lost access to that, because it just doesn't work anymore, which is a shame, then I just kind of go off of measurements and scale weight. And I really don't think body fat percentage is really that accurate. And so I wouldn't really invest in doing those too often because, again, a fluctuation, if it reads 1% higher, 1% lower, let's say one day you measured it, you're 18, the next day you measure it, you're 16. Well, that's a difference of potentially 4 pounds of muscle that it's missing just by being off 1% one way or the other. So I really don't think that in of itself is a great way to measure it. But it is better than just looking at scale weight. And it is better than just looking at the mirror, because a lot of times we can be a similar body fat percentage and we can have, potentially, different measurements, but we look in the mirror and it's like, oh, I gained 7 pounds. I look just about as lean as I used to. Is that 7 pounds of muscle? Is that 7 pounds of fat? Is this fat just not registering? A lot of different things can happen. I've noticed that the mirror and progress pictures for me personally are not very good indicators, and that's why I don't really use them. But for other people, maybe your problem areas are very, visually apparent when you look in the mirror. They're very visually apparent when it comes to pictures. So obviously the mirror, I think when you're looking at yourself every day, you can kind of look and say, hey, I've gotten so used to me being at this certain body fat percentage, you lose sight of how, defined you are. And so if you've been bulking for a while, you may think that you're not as fat as you are. Or if you've been really lean for a while, you may think that you're fatter than you are, when in reality, you've just become accustomed to being lean. So the mirror is really misleading. I think progress pictures can also be very misleading, especially if they're in different lights. But focusing on body fat percentage, focusing on measurements is a really big deal. And also just, again, going back to that progressive overload thing, I think that's been the new trend of, we had a period where it was put on X amount of weight on your lifts and you're good. And then we had a period of hey, everybody's focusing on the pump. Everybody's focusing on mind muscle connection, time under tension. And that kind of took the world by storm, and everybody was not really focusing on their lifts. And then now we've kind of gone back to nobody cares about the pump. Nobody cares about time under tension. Nobody cares about any of these other factors except am I getting stronger? And that's a very, very misleading path to go down. And that's something that I just got out of doing recently. And so I would really caution against that if you are an advanced lifter, because you get into this idea, wow, my progress is so much better than it's ever been. I must be gaining all this muscle. And you could potentially waste years of your advanced training, which again, when progress is really slow, you really need time. And if you're wasting time, probably not a good situation to be in. So those are my thoughts on that. Just kind of wanted to go on a little bit of a rant because I have noticed that progressive overload crowd of just being hyper obsessed about their lifts, and even not like bench press, squat, and all those things, but just like, oh, this chest supported row machine or this preacher curl machine. It's like, okay, let's take a step back and look at other metrics and not just go down a path of 3 years of focusing on just a few lifts to gauge where we're at, when we can actually look at our physique and we can take measurements and we can be a little bit more nuanced about these things. So hopefully that helps save some of you guys some time and not waste too much of it focusing on the wrong things. But at the end of the day, progressive overload is still very important. It's just, again, it's an outcome of good training as opposed to the thing that dictates that your training is good. So anyway, that's all I got to say about that. I'll keep you posted and I'll talk to you soon.